Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Glad to be here.
So today, we are looking at organized religion through a completely different lens, not as a spiritual journey, but as a massive, sophisticated economic engine. I mean, from ancient temples managing agriculture to modern megachurches pulling in billions with concert-level productions, we're unpacking how the mechanics of faith perfectly mirror the blueprints of global corporations. If you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button.
It is quite the journey we're taking today.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is to analyze the sources we have and really explore the hidden financial, marketing, and political systems that have driven religious institutions for millennia. Basically, we are lifting the hood on the faith economy.
Yeah, and before we dive in, we really need to set a firm analytical boundary for this discussion. Because, the tension between theism and atheism is this very powerful undercurrent in our sources. And we are going to use both perspectives as lenses today. But our objective is not to take a side. We aren't here to validate anyone's personal faith, and we aren't endorsing atheism either.
Exactly.
Like, if you're a devoted believer listening to this, you might view these economic structures as just, well, the necessary earthly vessels for divine truth, right?
Sure.
But if you're a committed atheist, you might view the entire concept of a deity as the ultimate marketing fabrication,
Right.
designed to extract wealth. But regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, the structural and financial mechanics, they operate exactly the same way. We are just analyzing the blueprint of the machine itself.
Which means we kind of have to abandon this idea that the megachurch or the super wealthy religious institution is some modern phenomenon born out of television and capitalism.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you look at ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt, I think the standard mental image is a group of priests in robes, burning incense and praying for a good harvest.
Right, the Hollywood version.
Yeah, the Hollywood version. But the sources reveal a completely different reality. Those temples were actually the centralized command hubs for entire civilizations. They were essentially the original Wall Street.
Right.
Holding spiritual authority and holding an economic monopoly, they were indistinguishable.
Well, I would actually push back a little on the Wall Street analogy, to be honest.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Because Wall Street facilitates decentralized trading,
Yeah.
right? The movement of capital between private entities.
Yeah.
Ancient temples operated much more like an authoritarian command economy, or honestly, maybe more like an ancient Amazon fulfillment network, if Amazon claimed its CEO was the sun god.
Okay, that is a wild image.
But it's true. In Mesopotamia, the Ziggurats weren't just for chanting. They functioned as the region's primary grain silos and administrative centers.
Like literal physical storage for the economy.
Literally.
Hmm.
And if you control the grain storage in an agrarian society, you control human survival itself. The priests managed labor allocations, they distributed rations, and they implemented early taxation. Their spiritual authority provided the absolute leverage they needed to enforce economic compliance.
So that totally reframes the whole concept of an offering, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because bringing a sacrifice to the temple wasn't just this pure act of piety. It was basically a mandatory tax payment to the state's central bank.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is the core survival mechanic of any organization. As soon as a sincere spiritual idea, whether that's a profound revelation or just a new philosophy, as soon as it gathers a following and becomes an organized institution, it instantly enters the world of resource management.
Because you suddenly have overhead.
Right. It requires capital. You have to quarry stone to build the temple. You have to feed the expanding clergy. You have to fund outreach. So this transition from a purely spiritual movement into a ruthless economic entity, it isn't necessarily a corruption of the original idea.
It's just a structural prerequisite for survival.
Exactly. You can't separate the two.
And the medieval Catholic Church really took that survival mechanic and scaled it across an entire continent. I think we all know they collected tithes, like roughly 10% of income. But the sources emphasize the massive macroeconomic impact of that wealth.
Oh, it was staggering.
Yeah. The church became the largest landowner in Western Europe. They weren't just holding weekly services, they were acting as the primary engine for agricultural yield and regional liquidity.
And, this pattern transcends Western Christianity entirely. It's not just a European thing. Consider the Buddhist traditions across Asia.
Right.
Monasteries didn't just meditate. They converted royal patronage into massive untaxed land accumulations. They created generational wealth that allowed them to act as regional power brokers. Or look at the Islamic Waqf system.
Explain that one, because that was super interesting in the sources.
Yeah, so a Waqf is a charitable endowment. A wealthy individual dedicates a property, like a farm or maybe a market, to fund a mosque or a hospital or some sort of social service.
But on paper, that just sounds like standard philanthropy, right? Like someone giving back. Where's the economic leverage in that?
The leverage is entirely in the legal mechanics. Once a property was designated as a Waqf, it became immune to confiscation by the sovereign state.
Mm.
And crucially, it was generally exempt from standard taxation. So wealthy families would establish a Waqf for a public good, but legally appoint their own descendants as the salaried administrators of that trust.
Oh, wow. So they get to keep the money in the family.
Exactly. It functioned as an ironclad medieval tax shelter. It was a mechanism for preserving generational family wealth, all heavily intertwined with religious authority.
Okay, so the ancient administrative infrastructure was incredibly sophisticated. But this introduces a massive conceptual friction point for me. Well, a traditional monopoly controls a physical necessity, right? Grain, water, oil. If you shut off the grain, people starve. It's tangible.
Right.
But religion sells something entirely abstract. Salvation, enlightenment, divine favor. You cannot hold those in your hand, and you certainly can't test them for quality control.
Nope.
So how do you possibly build a marketing strategy or an empire when the entire product is an unmeasurable, invisible promise?
You build it through unparalleled branding and the absolute optimization of human psychology. And this is where the atheist critiques in our sources are particularly sharp.
Let's hear it.
From a secular viewpoint, selling an intangible promise is, well, it's the ultimate grift. Your production costs are zero.
Right.
And customer satisfaction can only be disputed after the customer is dead.
Which is very convenient for the seller.
Very. So to maintain that revenue stream, the institution has to manufacture the demand. They have to convince the consumer that they are suffering from a terminal spiritual disease and then offer the only exclusive cure.
It's the ultimate problem, reaction, solution marketing funnel.
Exactly.
And the branding they use to scale that funnel predates modern corporate identity by millennia. I mean, long before Nike had the swoosh or Apple had the bitten apple, religions engineered the most potent, globally recognized logos in human history.
They really did.
The Christian cross, the Islamic crescent, the Buddhist Dharma wheel. Those symbols instantly signal a hyper-specific set of values. They signal community identity and a loyalty test, all baked into just a single visual.
But, a logo only retains power if the narrative behind it answers the consumer's deepest pain point.
Which is what, in this context?
Existential dread. Human beings are terrified of mortality. We are terrified of the chaos of an indifferent universe. So the ultimate value proposition of religion is narrative certainty.
Right. It makes sense of the chaos.
Yeah. It provides an origin story,
Well,
a strict moral framework for the present, and the absolute guarantee of ultimate justice in the future.
And once they buy into that, let's look at the customer retention strategies required to protect that narrative. Because in the tech world, we talk about vendor lock-in all the time.
Oh, sure.
The idea that once you buy an iPhone, you buy the Mac, you buy the watch, and you put all your photos on iCloud, eventually switching to Android becomes just way too painful because you lose your entire digital ecosystem.
Right.
Religious institutions engineered the ultimate vendor lock-in, but the switching costs aren't digital. They are deeply personal and social.
Because the sources outline how doubt is fundamentally penalized in these structures. If you question a corporate product, you just go buy a competitor's brand. No big deal.
Yeah, nobody shuns you for buying a Samsung.
Exactly. But in many religious frameworks, questioning the product is framed as an intrinsic moral failure. It's a danger. So the cost of canceling your subscription, so to speak, is astronomical. You don't just lose a belief system. You risk absolute social excommunication.
You lose your familial network,
Your friends.
your community support structures, everything.
Everything.
And for a believer, obviously, that insularity is experienced as a protective, loving community, keeping them safe from a corrupted world.
Yes.
But applying that atheist lens from our sources, it looks a lot like a coercive hostage situation. The system is designed to make the psychological and social cost of leaving so devastating that the consumer will just suppress their own critical thinking to maintain their social survival.
Which brings us to a really fascinating structural pivot. Because when an organization achieves that level of psychological monopoly, and it possesses massive idle capital from tithes and endowments, it faces a new threat.
The government.
Yes. Idle capital is always vulnerable to the state. So the only way to protect the wealth generated by the intangible product is to shape the physical laws of the land.
It's the natural progression of a monopoly. You merge with the political apparatus to insulate yourself.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you see perpetual feedback loop between religious institutions and secular governments. It is a mutually beneficial trade.
Yeah.
The religious institution offers the state divine legitimacy. They convince the populace that the king or the government is ordained by the ultimate authority. And in exchange, the state grants the religious institution military protection, legal enforcement of his doctrines, and, of course, tax exemptions.
Okay, the investiture controversy in the 11th century perfectly illustrates this.
Well, that's a great example.
Yeah, our sources highlight this huge showdown between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. And history classes often frame this as this really dense theological debate about who gets to hand a staff and a ring to a new bishop.
Like it's just about a ceremony.
Exactly. But look at the underlying mechanics. Bishops managed vast tracts of prime European real estate. They collected massive revenues.
Yeah, the conflict was essentially a boardroom brawl over who controlled the franchise managers. If the Pope appoints the bishop, the wealth of those German lands flows south to Rome. But if the emperor appoints the bishop, the wealth stays within the secular state. It had almost nothing to do with theology. It was a brutal contest over territorial revenue and capital extraction.
And that drive for capital extraction became so overt that it literally broke the monopoly. I mean, the sale of indulgences in the late Middle Ages is the moment the corporation basically said the quiet part out loud.
I really did.
Because the church was funding these massive, expensive infrastructure projects like St. Peter's Basilica, and they needed a rapid injection of liquidity. So what did? They commercialized the core product. They literally sold pieces of paper that guaranteed a reduction of punishment in the afterlife.
It was the financialization of salvation.
It's wild.
And the macroeconomic impact of this was severe. Indulgence sellers were draining local European economies. They were siphoning silver out of regional territories and funneling it directly to Rome. So the Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther, yes, it was fueled by genuine theological outrage.
But the princes supported it for a different reason.
Exactly. It succeeded because regional princes saw a golden opportunity to stop the economic bleeding and reclaim their local wealth from a foreign corporate power.
So fast forward to the modern era, and the mechanics of that lobbying power haven't disappeared at all. They've just been refined. Today, religious institutions operate as heavily subsidized political action committees.
Very much so.
They mobilize massive unified voting blocs. They draft legislation regarding marriage, education, reproductive rights, and they defend their tax-exempt status by pointing to the social services they provide. You know, the hospitals, the disaster relief, the schools.
Which is brilliant because by stepping in to fill the gaps where the secular state fails, they create an impenetrable public relations shield.
Nobody wants to tax the orphanage.
Exactly. It makes their tax-exempt status politically untouchable. But secular advocates point out the inherent friction here. These institutions leverage tax-free wealth to influence public policy, often imposing their specific doctrines on the entire populace.
Right.
It functions like a massive corporate lobby that dictates the regulatory environment, sometimes marginalizing minority groups or non-believers in the process.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Take the ancient Mesopotamian strategy of centralizing wealth. Combine it with the psychological vendor lock-in of the Middle Ages. Add the political lobbying power we see today.
Okay.
Now supercharge all of that with the internet, digital banking, and global broadcasting.
Oh, yeah.
You get the modern mega corporation of faith operating on a scale that ancient emperors couldn't even comprehend.
The sheer volume of modern religious wealth genuinely defies traditional economic categorization, largely because of the opacity of their financial reporting. I mean, the Catholic Church's global assets are practically incalculable. They are spread across thousands of distinct legal entities.
It's a black box.
Total black box. And consider the recent leaks regarding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their investment arm, Peak Advisors, was revealed to control over $100 billion in assets.
$100 billion.
$100 billion. A tax-exempt religious organization quietly managing a hedge fund-sized portfolio generated largely from the mandatory tithing of its members.
Okay, let's do a thought experiment here with the Protestant megachurches in the United States. Places like Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church down in Houston.
Sure.
Imagine I hand you their annual financial report, but I scrub all the religious terminology from the document entirely. You see revenue streams from merchandise sales, global streaming rights, massive book publishing advances, a sprawling real estate portfolio, and a state-of-the-art media production center.
You would immediately assume you were looking at a major entertainment studio, or maybe a Silicon Valley tech firm.
Exactly, because the operational mechanics are completely identical.
Yeah, the modern megachurch uses sophisticated data analytics to optimize their sales funnels, just like any tech company. They offer a low-barrier entry point, maybe free YouTube video, or a welcoming Sunday service with a rock band.
It'll get you in the door.
Right. Once you are in the door, the psychological and community retention strategies begin, gradually moving you up the commitment ladder until you become a consistent tithing member. And they have scaled their influence beyond physical borders now.
Oh, totally.
During a live-streamed service with concert-grade LED screens and, psychological lighting, a donation can be wired from a smartphone halfway across the planet in seconds.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though.
On court.
A believer would look at the massive LED screens, the data analytics, the wealth, and argue that it's simply good stewardship. If you truly believe you have the most important message in the universe, shouldn't you use the absolute best modern tools to broadcast it? Why should secular corporations have a monopoly on high-end production value?
That is the strongest defense of the model, without a doubt. And many leaders within these systems are deeply, deeply sincere about their mission. They view the wealth as just a tool for global outreach.
Right, it's just the medium.
Yeah. However, the secular critique zeroes in on the vulnerability of the structure itself. When a tax-exempt organization relies this heavily on charismatic leadership, slick branding, and consumer data, the line between spiritual ministry and a profit-driven franchise sort of evaporates.
Because the imperative of the institution begins to override the original message.
Exactly.
You see leaders flying on private jets, funded by tax-free donations, living in gated estates, all while preaching a gospel that originally championed poverty and humility. For the atheist, the modern megachurch isn't a corruption of religion. It is the ultimate perfected form of it. It is the raw exploitation of human existential fear, fully optimized by capitalism.
And that creates a real crisis of authenticity, even for the devoted. When an institution controls billions of dollars, its primary unwritten directive will always be self-preservation. It must protect the brand reputation at all costs. It must maintain the revenue streams, and it must silence internal dissent to prevent market share loss.
The administrative shell ultimately dictates the theology. So, what does this all mean? Why does mapping out this economic architecture matter to you, the listener, right now? Well, it matters because it fundamentally changes how you parse reality. Whether you view these sprawling institutions as divine forces holding society together or as massive legacy corporations selling a psychological placebo, their mechanics are shaping your world.
Very true.
Recognizing how they operate financially and politically gives you a sharper lens to interpret the zoning laws in your city, the rhetoric of your politicians, and the cultural shifts happening right around you. You stop seeing arbitrary events and start seeing the gears turning behind the curtain.
And, despite the corporate structuring, the lobbying, and the relentless wealth accumulation, the resilience of these institutions points to a pretty profound reality.
Which is?
Human beings possess an authentic, driving need for meaning. We need narrative clarity, and we need deep communal connection. The architectural structures providing those answers may operate with the cold efficiency of a Fortune 500 company, but the psychological void they are filling in the consumer, that is genuine.
Which leaves us with a fascinating disruptive thought to end on today. If the desire for meaning is an intrinsic human trait, what happens to the corporate structure of belief when we become an interplanetary species?
Oh, that's a wild thought.
Right. In the centuries to come, as humanity establishes colonies on Mars or spreads across the solar system, will we export these ancient earthbound business models? Will there be tax-exempt megachurches and Martian domes collecting tithes via interplanetary wire transfers?
It's hard to imagine.
Or will the massive physical, economic, and communication delays between planets completely break the centralized command structures we've relied on for millennia? It's entirely possible that leaving Earth will force the evolution of a completely decentralized, unmonetized spiritual framework, finally separating the human search for meaning from the business of belief. Keep thinking deeper.